Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shifting Paradigms. My name is Merve Isfahani. I'm the Academic Programs Manager at Columbia Global Centers Istanbul. It's such a pleasure to open today's session, which we're hosting in collaboration with our colleagues at Columbia Global Centers Amman and the Committee on Global Thought. For those joining us for the first time, Columbia Global is a university wide initiative that brings together major entities across Colombia, including our 11 global centers and the Committee on Global Thought, to address humanity's complex challenges. Together, we aim to connect rigorous scholarship with the pressing realities of today's world. The Shifting Paradigms series reflects exactly what Colombia does best, creating spaces for dialogue that challenge assumptions, bridge disciplines, and spark new ideas. This series explores how global structures are evolving and what those shifts mean for stability, security, and cooperation around the world. Today's discussion, Rethinking Post-Conflict Reconstruction in a Changing World Order, goes to the heart of one of today's most urgent issues. Across regions from Libya and Syria to Lebanon and beyond, the idea of reconstruction has taken on a new meaning in an era of shifting geopolitics. It's not just a technical or economic process, it's a deeply political one, shaped by questions of sovereignty, legitimacy, and power. We know that rebuilding begins long before any physical reconstruction takes place. It starts with who gets to define recovery, who controls resources, and whose vision of future takes hold. And as global dynamics shift, traditional aid frameworks are being redefined by new actors, each bringing new opportunities as well as new challenges. Through conversations like this one, we hope to think more critically about what it truly means to rebuild, not just in material terms, but in the social and institutional foundations that sustain peace and resilience. We are honored to be joined today by our distinguished speakers. Joseph Dahar is an associate researcher at the Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies and an expert on the political economy of the Middle East. Jean-Marie Guénot, Arnold Salzman Professor of Practice in International and Public Affairs, Director of SIPA's Kent Global Leadership Program on Conflict Resolution, and Director of the International Conflict Resolution Specialization, and Jalal Harchau, political scientist specializing in North Africa with a particular focus on Libya. And now it's my great pleasure to hand the floor over to our moderator, Adam Tooze, the Catherine and Shelby Colum Davis Professor of History, Chair of the Committee on Global Thought, and Director of the European Institute at Columbia University. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mavi, and thank you to all of the teams at Columbia Global and the Global Centers in the Middle East for helping us put together this fantastic panel. It's an urgent topic, a weighty topic, and one that it's really a privilege to be able to have this conversation about. The way we're going to run things is that I'm going to put a series of questions to our extraordinary group of panelists, and then we'll go back and forth. And then at about the 45-minute mark or so, we'll open for questions. So please post your questions through the Zoom function, and we look forward to addressing those as best we can. We seem to be having some feedback on the line from some side. If somebody can mute, that will be a great help. Thank you. So the first question that we thought we would address is simply to get a sense of geographical location and a particular zone. How is it that the question of reconstruction is being posed? And this obviously varies across the region, across local and specific contexts. And I thought we would perhaps start with Jalal, with a particular focus on Libya. and ask you how the question of reconstruction has emerged where you are and where you're thinking about.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm very honored to be here with you to speak about Libya and reconstruction. I'm a huge fan of absolutely everyone involved in this webinar, so thank you again. It's true that the things should be relocated in space and in time. As of right now, the noun reconstruction in the Middle East has become almost inextricably attached to the tragedy in Gaza, and to really locate the start or the moment, if you will, and the locus of when reconstruction has become a real phenomenon in present day, in other words, post 2011 Libya. The moment is very precise. It was in the wee hours of September 11th, or actually a few hours before, in a coastal city by the name of Derna, located in not far from Egypt in eastern Libya. And in the space of a few hours, because of an unusually strong rainstorm, roughly 12,000 lives would be taken in a matter of hours. So it's interesting to compare the intensity of that sort of suffering. It's actually comparable to what happened in Gaza in some ways. Like, imagine a city of roughly 110,000 people, and more than 10% just meet their fates in just a few hours in the night. And that city had been neglected. It is still a very rich city culturally, and it had been neglected during Gaddafi because of political reasons, and roughly the same reasons had caused the same city to be isolated, sometimes even besieged, under Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar in the east, particularly since he began his campaign to retake Benghazi in 2014 from political Islamists. And the topic of rebuilding Derna had actually existed before that moment of September 10th, 2023. So we're literally 3 weeks before the start of Gaza, and we're a few months after the large earthquake in Syria and Turkey. So here, what's very interesting, as I said, is that Libya, of course, is split in two. You have the UN recognized government in Tripoli, and then you have this very strong faction which holds the majority of the country from the territorial perspective, including Derna, the Haftar family in the east. And both had been coexisting for a couple of years. The last time we had a major exchange of fire in Libya was more than half a decade ago. So reconstruction had tried to start, and it was in fact this tragedy that provided the Haftar family domestically and internationally with the ideal narrative, although the Haftar family was partially responsible for what happened in terms of negligence, and Tripoli also shared the culpability in that regard in terms of the infrastructure. But the bottom line is that the Haftar family decided not to do the strict minimum. They decided to do reconstruction very well in Derna, and then basically expand the same program from there. And that effort has still been ongoing. It's not completely clean, but I thought it was interesting to locate the start of this reconstruction, because the reconstruction in Libya could have started before. It really took that disaster in Derna to kickstart things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for bringing that catastrophic phase in the region really into sharp focus. I had, of course, seen all of the stories, but not put them together in my head in the way that you just did with the earthquake, the ghastly events in Derna, and then October 7th as a sort of unit. That's very illuminating and extraordinarily helpful. Joseph, in the hugely complex zone that you focused your attention on, how has the issue of reconstruction emerged across the space that you keep your eyes on?
Thank you, Adam. Thank you to all the organizers. It's a pleasure to be with you, with also respected colleagues, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion on on a matter that is very much important, especially for the region of the Levant. I will try to focus my intervention right now on Syria and Lebanon because they do share some similar dynamics, even though we could say that, Lebanon's reconstruction process has been did not stop since the 90s in many ways. The first reconstruction plan of the 90s, and in many ways, the Lebanese economic crisis of 2019 is rooted in the particular policies of the economic reconstruction process, showing the importance, of building the right fundamentals. And this kind of debate is coming back today, both in Syria and Lebanon. Obviously, the reconstruction process discussion have been ongoing for the case of Syria for years now, but was completely blocked mainly because of the sanctions against the former Assad regime that fell in December 2024 after 14 years of uprising turned into a war, more than 50 years of a family dictatorship. And we can see that the level of discussion is, incredible. We're talking about, in terms of physical destruction, damages on infrastructures, housing units, etc. We have between 100 billion to 220 billion USD. Generally, this is because we have to be careful. Very often we hear the amounts 1,000 billion of reconstruction costs, but this is the consequences of the economic loss. If we talk only about physical destructions, damages, the cost of this would be between, according to conservative, apparently, estimates by the World Bank lately in its latest report, 220 billion, but could go to 340 billion.
For Syria?
For Syria.
For Syria? For Syria.
This is for Syria. When it comes for the case of Lebanon, if you want, the reconstruction started after the so-called deal of the ceasefire. I say a so-called deal of the ceasefire. As we are seeing today in Gaza, the war is not finished. Since the conclusion of the ceasefire in Lebanon, more than 300 people have been targeted by the Israeli occupation army, has died, and any kind of attempt to reconstruction has been targeted also by Israeli occupation forces in the south, etc. But the cost of the latest war in Lebanon is apparently, in terms of physical destructions, more than 3.5 billion, while the economic cost as a whole is over 11 billion. So the major geopolitical changes in the region, both in Syria with the fall of the Assad regime, the weakening of Hezbollah, even though it's not at all the end of the political party, has brought forward, if you want, the reconstruction discussion, even though on the ground, nothing has happened yet. We have to be clear on this. The process in Syria of removing the sanctions is still ongoing, but moreover, we'll go back to this later on, but there are structural challenges. In both countries, what we've witnessed is if any forms of reconstruction have occurred, has been based on a local or individual basis. For example, communities gathering money or remittances from the diaspora abroad and trying to rebuild, especially in Syria, we've seen this in various localities, region, gathering money from the diaspora to try to rebuild infrastructures, etc. But if you go to Aleppo, if you go to Homs, if you go to the countryside of Damascus, it's still massively destroyed with no kind of process of reconstruction. Similarly, in Lebanon, no process of reconstruction has occurred. In both cases, geopolitical considerations have to be taken into account. This is without forgetting, you still have occupation of these lands by in Lebanon by Israel, but in Syria you have a deep fragmentation with various also foreign political forces present, from the south to the Israeli, to the north, the Turks that are still very much present in north side. So we have a discussion that has been brought forward that is advancing definitely because of geopolitical changes, of governments that are more seeking good relations with especially the US, but more generally the Western governments, whether the government of Ahmed al-Shara in Syria or the new Lebanese government. But at the same time, there are major structural challenges to any kind of reconstruction process, and still it hasn't started. And I think we'll come back also on the issue, and as it was explained, I think introduction, which is key to our understanding of reconstruction, it shouldn't be limited to reconstruction of physical infrastructures, but how we have a particular economic outlook of the future. Otherwise, we will just repeat what we witnessed in Lebanon in 2019, a new economic crisis.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for that opening tour d'horizon. Jean-Marie, speaking, you're the designated point man for the European observer of this situation. Do you see a serious European conversation about these fundamental problems of Europe's immediate neighbors going on? I mean, there's a well-documented conversation about Europe's prevarications over the question of Ukraine's reconstruction. Do you see a serious engagement on the part of either Brussels or national governments?
Well, I think that in Europe, I mean, people are torn between their Ukrainian priority and the need to look at what you call their immediate neighbors. I think European leaders do understand that there are very close links between Europe and the region. The links of geography, of course, the links of history. France was a mandatory power in Syria and Lebanon. The Europeans played a decisive role in the fall of Gaddafi. So they are definitely connected, but they're not sure whether they see the Mediterranean as a moat or as a bridge because of the obsession with immigration, the fact that indeed in Europe, contrary to the United States, there are very significant communities from the region, which contribute actually to the economic prosperity of Europe. But you know the debate with the extreme right and now the right on Europe on the Muslim communities in Europe. So it's a sensitive topic, and all that means that Europe is more disunited than united, I think, by what's going on in the region. You see it on the Israel-Palestine issue. There was this effort by France linking up with Saudi Arabia to push for the two-state solution, and that has been relatively successful. But it is something that many Europeans are wary of. They are fearful that I mean, the Jewish communities in Europe are increasingly worried by the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, but they see as a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. There is indeed, in some ways, the Israel-Palestine conflict is being imported now to Europe. So all that means that at the end of the day, I don't think there's a clean picture of European policy vis-à-vis the region. It's ambiguous because public opinion is ambiguous. When you think of Syria, you think of the jihadists, including European jihadists who went to Syria, even if it's not a big phenomenon, that's present in the minds. When you think of Libya, you think of deals with the Coast Guard to stop migrants from getting into Europe. When you think of Lebanon, that's a bit different. I think there is a sense that Lebanon, especially for France, is a country that needs to be supported, and there is a certain willingness to help the Lebanese government in its present predicament with the Israeli continued attacks in Lebanon. But again, because of all the background, there is not a very strong, clear message, I think, coming from Europe.
Thank you so much. I mean, it would be interesting at this point, perhaps starting again with Jalal, to go to the questions of who the agents are here. We're going to talk about political economy in a moment, but perhaps one might first of all start with around asking the question, who are the agents of reconstruction? Who are the people who are going to be acting? Would it be sensible to apply a kind of conventional mindset that says that it's governments that are really the drivers of change here? Or is that is that a problematic assumption, an unhelpful kind of simplification, or is the question really, are states being formed? Is the question more protean? How out of these zones of crisis, governance and power and states are constituted?
Well, it's a very crucial question, obviously, because my first answer would tend to be, I think in Libya, reconstruction is almost used as a means of not unifying the state, not unifying the budget, maintaining opacity. You were asking about the agents. The agents are very numerous, very familial. We have a dynastic logic, as I said earlier, both in Tripoli and in Benghazi in the east. The reason I've had the tendency to insist a lot on the east is because the family in the east, family of Khalifa Haftar and his sons, have been the agents dominating the file of reconstruction. Just to give you an idea, and the irony of it also is the fact that you have two non-recognized nationwide reconstruction vehicles in the east, based in the east, and each one led by one of the sons of Field Marshal Haftar. So one son, a civilian one who has no brigade or no security mandate, Balqasem, is the one who seized the opportunity of Dana, as I mentioned earlier. But of course, the heir apparent is Saddam, who's a lieutenant general, almost certain to become the successor of his father in case his father dies. And he also had the time to put together a very ambitious, very aggressive, and very active. We're talking about an ongoing reconstruction. We're talking about projects you can actually see and visit, bridges, stadiums, clinics. Sometimes when a hospital is inaugurated, it's just the walls are inaugurated. It's clean, it's impressive, but the equipment sometimes is missing, and more cruelly, the personnel is always displaying a form of shortage. So that makes me think of an important sentence that I stole from Morocco just a few weeks ago. There was a young Moroccan woman who was captured in some video documentaries saying, we want hospitals, not just stadiums. Well, in Libya, you have a lot of stadiums. The priority is definitely stadiums, hotels, skyscrapers, things that...
Stadiums for soccer? What is it? What is played in the stadium?
Yeah,
for soccer?
Yeah,
soccer
absolutely.
is the...
Yeah. There's one that was inaugurated just a few months ago at huge costs in Benghazi. There's another one. And I think the one in Derna was built almost before some of the most crucial residential units that the population were waiting. And that actually asks a lot of interesting questions about the political economy. Why is the elite attracted to those form of contracts first, rather than the less exciting, more boring expenditures like building proper school or a proper hospital, or sometimes maintaining old structures that actually are still operating and do not require a very sexy injection of capital, just a boring injection of small amounts. That, of course, is less attractive from a bribery or from a kickback perspective. So you always have to kind of look at things that way. But what's interesting in terms of how all of this started, and again, it started from the East. By the way, the argument of reconstruction has been very, very important historically for the Dabeiba family. Abdulhamid Dabeiba is the UN, still to this moment, the UN recognized prime minister in Tripoli, and the fame of that particular, not necessarily positive, the fame of that particular family was built based on the reconstruction, quote unquote, reconstruction effort that had been carried out by Gaddafi in the final years, 2005, 2010, thanks to the reintegration in the West and the high prices of oil, the ability to spend money and bring in foreign companies. But when it comes to whatever was kickstarted by the East was interesting because it began with a phase of suppression and repression. The population of Dana was initially quite understandably angry. So that was the first step. And here, the reason I'm mentioning is the silence of the West. And of course, then the decision to spend a lot of money. And the first companies that were invited, and we can spend more time on this, were non-Western companies. First Egyptian, and then Turkish, Emiratis, and then only after that, French and Portuguese and so on.
Let's come on to the political economy in a minute. Let me spin the question back to Joseph. I mean, Jalal, you've painted such an extraordinarily vivid image for us of kind of a familial dynastic logic of reconstruction, as you say, put it brilliantly, a kind of paradoxically reconstruction, or perhaps a conventional mind to a conventional mind paradox that reconstruction is a mechanism for perpetuating dynastic strategies of division. So it's kind of both reconstructive and against the project of forming a nation state. Do you see similar dynamics playing out, Joseph, in the Syrian and Lebanese spaces, or is something else going on in the Levant?
Well, what is quite clear for me is that reconstruction policies, as we've seen it in the past in Lebanon, was clearly a tool to consolidate the power of a new ruling elite after the civil war, with the sponsorship of Syria and Saudi Arabia. This was materialized by Rafiq al-Hariri in many ways, and other affiliates that are still very much, unfortunately, playing a role in Lebanon. If you look at Nabi Berri, head of the parliament, or Walid Jumlat, or others with additional personnel. Moreover, reconstruction not only consolidated particular centers of power, but deepen previous socioeconomic problems, underdevelopment of particular regions, and a particular, process of, let's say, capital accumulation. What our colleague Jalal was talking about, stadium, major investment projects, skyscrapers, etc., was seen in Beirut. If you go today to Beirut, what is called the reconstruction is basically a fancy centre-ville called Solidaire, in which you had, a far majority of the people going there are not people from Lebanon living there. It's a part of the diaspora, it's touristic, and it has never served, a reconstruction policy for the whole of Lebanon or tackling the socioeconomic inequalities. Still, the Bekaa, the north, was very much underdeveloped, in many ways the south. Moreover, we've seen characteristics of the prior to the war, a focus on finance, real estate, luxurious economic projects, non-productive sectors of the economy, and agriculture and manufacturing even, being less important in the Lebanese national economy. So therefore, an economy that was completely dependent first on foreign direct investment, focused on non-productive sectors of the economy, and remittances sent by, the Lebanese, mostly in the Gulf, but also in Europe, etc. And what we're witnessing today in Syria is quite a bit a project of a reconstruction process, very similar to what we witnessed in Lebanon post-Civil War, focusing, if you see, most of the projects are focusing on luxurious, big economic projects of reconstruction or construction even, real estate, tourism, finance, and not at all any kind of focus on the productive sectors of the economy. And what I'm often saying, with all due respect to, to my Lebanese colleagues, etc., that Syria's economy is becoming more and more like Lebanon. Syria used to be a productive country when strong, agriculture, manufacturing industry. Prior to 2011, Syria was exporting total value, 12 billion in terms of export. Today, we're not exceeding $1 billion. The manufacturing industry was very well known in Aleppo, Damascus. This has been massively destroyed and is being destroyed by the current policies of the government to focus on trade, to import particular products, particularly coming from Turkey or China. So what we're witnessing actually is, in both cases, reconstruction process serving new forms of business networks, affiliated with the centers of power, a form to consolidate one's power, but also reproducing social inequalities and underdevelopment in particular sectors of the economy, which is, for me, a recipe for another catastrophe. And this here, we come back again to the roots of the Lebanese crisis in 2019. It is completely linked to the reconstruction process that occurred in the 90s, and that was, continued by various elites. So here is why it's so important to have good governance, but also a political economy that breaks with the kind of capital dynamics focusing only on non-productive sectors of the economy and basically being dependent on foreign investment, remittances, etc., which is not particular to Syria and Lebanon, but to many countries, unfortunately, of the Middle East and North Africa.
There's a very interesting contrast between your characterization of the Levant and Jalal's. Jalal gave us this crisp kind of diagnosis in terms of dynastic strategies, including like the sons of, the sons of so and sons of sons. So there's a kind of truly genealogical kind of account. Whereas Joseph, what I hear from your account of Syria and Lebanon is kind of almost more familiar to me. I mean, basically, you're criticizing a lack of productive sectors, a largely rentier kind of economic growth. Are there any analogs in the Syrian and Lebanese situation to the kind of dynastic power projects that Jalal was focused on, or is the still in the Lebanese situation, are things effectively still running through the state machinery? So that we're talking about a political economy which has a rather different character than the one that Jalal was talking about.
No, I think, well, where you have two, and correct me please, Jalal, if I'm wrong, but two strong centers of power in Libya. In Lebanon, it's a more diffuse one with various sectarian fractions of the bourgeoisie or the elite of Lebanon, where you have Hariri are less present today, but you still have the Jumlat family playing a quite important role. You have Nabi Berri. Well, he doesn't have a son, but it's within the Harakat Amal. But you have different kind of business circles that also have this kind of, if you want to speak about the genealogical various sons of that become heads of parties. So you do have this kind of dynamics, even though I would say more diffuse. And this could have been the case actually in Syria if the regime had remained. This was one of the main objectives of the Assad regime, basically seeking a form of reconstruction that would also consolidate, the former presidential palace represented, symbolized by the Assad family.
That's fascinating. Jean-Marie, when we were doing our prep call, and we started talking about the logics of regions of conflict, you with your vast experience of the analysis and peacekeeping efforts, immediately sort of moved to a comparative question about the dynamic of conflict and what sustains it. It would be lovely to get your bird's eye view, if you like, of the way in which these conflicts appear to you, how they fit within more general patterns of the political economy of conflicted societies.
Well, I think what's interesting in particular is the Libyan conflict, because one could call it a self-sustaining conflict. The Libyan economy is a rentier economy. And so, as Jalal said, it's about who captures the rent, and that consolidates patronage system where all major actors have no interest in a strong state, because that would weaken their grip on the national wealth, which has to be a private wealth. I think that's very different from either Lebanon or Syria, where there is no real national. In Syria, as Joseph said, yes, there was agriculture, there was industry, but there is not. Syria never was a rentier state. So now it's about how you capture patronage from external actors. And that's quite a different proposition. External actors, either from the diaspora or from the Gulf countries, or possibly from China, all the actors that have been mentioned in our conversation. And I think that puts the Europeans and the European Union in a very unusual situation, because they have been used to have a somewhat technocratic view of reconstruction. You deal with the government, or if the government has, for all practical purpose, collapsed, you substitute for it. now you are in competition with other actors who don't have the same rationale. And I think the Europeans don't quite know how to insert themselves in this new patronage, so to speak, way of doing things. They're a bit at a loss, in my view, on how to deal with it. Of course, the big European companies, they are not at a loss. When you think of Eni or Total in Libya, they certainly can navigate and trying to navigate. And Jalal could speak in more detail about that in this Libyan economy. But the states themselves, they were used to a kind of what they called a standard treatment. So real estate infrastructure has been destroyed by conflict. You come, you rebuild, and that's the end of the story. And as you do that, you build the government or you deal with the government. Now you deal with various private actors or even countries, but countries that have private interests, so to speak. And that's very new. And the Europeans are trying to find their way. I'm not sure they have found their way yet. I think in Lebanon, probably because there are ancient financial connections between Europe and Lebanon, that will be easier. In the case of Syria, the political factors that we were discussing earlier get in the way, and I don't know exactly how it's going to happen.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. I'd love to get the reactions of Jalal and Joseph to that. Maybe we should start with the Libyan side and then move to Syria, Lebanon. Jalal, how does that,
Well,
Jean-Marie's perspective land with you?
Yeah, everything that Jean-Marie has said, of course, is very, very important. I think it's the right way to approach things by remembering that the West is no longer the center of the universe. I mean, that's true from a political decision-making process perspective, and also in terms of just the money. Like I keep talking about Derna because it has been my flagship example. Less than 5% of the money spent on rebuilding Derna, and Derna is a very good cause. It's a very noble cause. You have a lot of innocents who died, a lot of civilians, a lot of very innocuous things to rebuild, and it's obviously in the right direction. And less than 5% has been from international donations. And within that 5%, only a fraction is from the West. The vast majority is Libyan wealth. And of course, it has been spent in very opaque circumstances. And what's interesting to add to what Jean-Marie was explaining about the European perspective is that the Europeans don't know how, they don't understand the rules. And when they understand them, they realize that it's kind of beyond the pale in terms of their own internal safeguards and anti-corruption laws. But they're not saying no. The European firms are not necessarily the giant ones. The sometimes medium-sized enterprises are still pressuring their governments to be able to seize a portion of those opportunities in Eastern Libya and Western Libya. Even a large world power like the US, because of the current dynamic we see out of the current administration, we see sometimes very, very small companies influencing policy simply because, maybe a $400 million contract could be won here, maybe another 600 million. So it's not necessarily all driven by the Exxons and the Enies of the world. You have a whole bunch of small companies looking for very tiny opportunities, but still huge consequences in terms of the acceptance of the West vis-a-vis the opacity, the repression, the lack of elections, the lack of budget, and so on and so forth. And just to also echo what Jean-Marie was talking about earlier about migration, I'd like to remind everyone that Greece, through its island of Crete, has undergone a major crisis in terms of extra irregular arrivals since June. And it's probably like thousands and thousands per month, in addition to the drip that it was already experiencing. A lot of that had been orchestrated very deliberately by the the Eastern Libyan forces, the Haftar family, and look at the reaction. More praise, more positive comments, more willingness to help, and no censure, no condemnation, just an embrace. I think that says a lot about the current, and including in the field of reconstruction. So that says a lot about the European position today. Again, the logic is dominated by non-Western powers: Turkey, China, Egypt, UAE, and then much farther down the list, you have the Europeans and also the Americans, who don't seem to realize that they're not really calling the shots. They still have the illusion of being at the center of it all.
Joseph, does this kind of snowballing characterization make sense for you in Syria and Lebanon?
Well, when it comes to Lebanon and Syria today, politically, the main country pulling the shots is definitely the US when it comes. It doesn't mean that they are not
It
aiding
is.
It is the US, sure. It is giving the tempo, if you want, or the main dynamics when you see it, because the key debate today in Lebanon is around demilitarization, of Hezbollah. Everything is connected to this potential reconstruction that will be mostly funded not necessarily by the US, but by the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia. But the green light will be given when the US said if the Lebanese government is being pushed to demilitarize Hezbollah. And until then, no reconstruction will happen. And you see the back and forth are made by the US dignitaries. So France, most especially, as our colleague Jean-Marie was talking, has economic, political capital in Lebanon for historical reasons, but until today. But it is not able to balance, the importance and the significance of the US. It wants to have a kind of political difference. You can see this historically also by the fact that, although many people could say it's a superficial separation, but the fact that France never characterized the political party Hezbollah as a terrorist, only its armed branch, to maintain, the possibility to discuss with it, because it understands that Hezbollah, whether we like it or not, is a huge constituency of the Lebanese people, and you have to deal with them. When it comes to Syria also, we mostly see, so here we do have the European Union, but the main European actor when it comes to Syria is more Germany, connected for migration, but also the aid investment, the role of the GIZ and other economic actors. But here again, the key actor is the US with Gulf and Turkey. Here, Turkey has a much bigger role in the case of Syria. And we see very often also in terms of forms of intermediary to find solutions to high rising hostilities between, or tensions, let's say, not hostilities, but tensions between Turkey and Israel. It's the US that tries to calm things down. So I think here the European Union, unfortunately, is mostly acting as a follower, seeing what the US is saying, nodding. When you compare, the kind of principles the European Union had before the fall of the regime and the demands they had to the certain regime today, the US is moving forward with the current government despite its lack of participation from below, democratic credentials, lack of, certain number of aspects. The European Union, until now, what I've seen, my discussions are still very much positive about this government, because also the US is seeing, and they're seeing also the Gulf quite positive and having given the green light to this government. When it comes to economic investments, in both cases, so Lebanon is a bit different. You had lastly a delegation of French big companies visiting Lebanon. They have more interest. There was the same delegation, was the numbers much smaller when it went to Syria, because it has less interest, because in Syria, most of the investment opportunities are taken by Gulf monarchies and Turkey. And basically the Gulf will pay, and the Turkish, because they have the know-how, will rebuild mostly. So we're seeing really much falling back, whether politically or economically, European Union, I think, in Syria and Lebanon, and more generally in the region.
This is an absolutely fascinating contrast, and if you don't mind, I would just love to dig into it to a little bit more, because when Jalal was speaking, I was happily nodding along and going, yes, decline of the West, obviously, new configuration, new multipolarity, it all made sense. And then Joseph gives us this very different perspective. Joseph, would I be correctly characterizing the role of the US as kind of like the conductor of an orchestra or the band leader or something like that, in that the Americans aren't necessarily putting boots on the ground, but they can do the drone strikes. And they're not necessarily putting their own money in harm's way, but they're very happy to broker or feel it imperative to broker a deal that would be Gulf money and Turkish expertise as part of a strategy that they have to have because Iran and because Israel. And so America can't absent itself. Whereas Libya is Africa, and therefore they just really basically don't care that much. And so in that zone, Jalal's account would be more compelling. Maybe even Russia enters as a key player in the Libyan scenario, as it once was in Syria, but has been largely expelled. I mean, I'm just trying to rationalize these.
A lot of what you said actually applies to Libya as well. You have this standoffish kind of attitude where the US matters without touching things directly.
Oh, tell us more about that, Jalal. Give us that, because that would flesh out the picture for us in a really helpful way.
Well, very briefly, I would tend to say that the West in general, and particularly the US to this moment, because the US is just outsized, it matters from a dollar perspective, from all kinds of structural standpoints. You have this very sticky notion of always being able to outsource a chunk of Libya to a US partner, let's say Western Libya to Turkey. And then you listen to Egypt when it comes to Eastern Libya. So, which means that if Egypt accepts Russia, you're not able to really take action because Egypt is not really against Russia. But since you're driven by this hope of always being in a position to outsource a secondary country like Libya to US partners, you end up still mattering, but not taking direct action. So your opinion still matters, but the opinion of countries like Turkey, the UAE, and other US partners matters tremendously. So that's the kind of ambiguity that remains. And I would say that it's a constant theme since 2011 with the West mattering less and less. In other words, the West doesn't realize that this idea of outsourcing doesn't really work. It doesn't really work out. You have the illusion of always beating the system, always being smart and spending very little and not undergoing the consequences. But if you just step back, you realize that you're losing influence.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Lebanon, the issue of how the Lebanese army is going to be strengthened is key. After the war of 2006, there was not a serious effort to build up the Lebanese army, and the Hezbollah, in all fairness, was much stronger even after the war of 2006 than it is now. So now there's a real window for the Lebanese state to reassert itself. It'll be interesting whether the Americans do the bulk of the job in building up the Lebanese army, or whether the Europeans, and in particular the French, do something. But the French are in a very difficult financial situation, so I don't think they have the cash. So I think at the end of the day, it will end up probably with the US, probably.
May I, Adam?
Yeah, please, please, please.
I think there's two levels to the discussion. Obviously, the geopolitical location is very much important. The why is the US so much interested and involved in the case of Lebanon and Syria? This is connected to what happened post 7th October and Palestine, let's say clearly. And the key objective for the US is Israel's normalization in the region, to go forward with this. This is why it's so much involved in Syria, Lebanon, or even, and you can see it, the latest so-called ceasefire in Gaza is not about finding a peace solution. It's about further integrating Israel to the region. And this is what the first quote Trump said. I hope other countries will join the Abraham Accord. Under the table as well, we know that the fast process, relatively fast, let's say, removal of sanctions of Syria was not made for free. And my analysis is that most probably there's a deal towards a form of normalization. And on numerous occasions, the new interim president of Syria, despite his jihadist backgrounds, I think we should really analyze his policies not as a jihadist, but as a very pragmatic, conservative, non-democratic, whatever you want, political figure. But he's seeking to consolidate its power. And in this perspective, normalizing with Israel, seeking an alliance with the US is a key issue. So this is the first thing why the US is so much involved here. The question of normalization of Israel is key because this will consolidate US power in the region, facing the rise of China, the rise of other international powers. So this is key. The second issue, and I think I always do this joke, but in Syria and Lebanon now, we become more and more specialists of Max Weber, meaning the state monopoly of violence to justify, this will be the end game to justify the legitimacy of the state, and especially through the army. And I think in both Lebanon and Syria, it's short-sighted to only see legitimacy through arms and violence. Even though you would strengthen these two armed institutions, this will not strengthen the legitimacy of a state that is not providing social services to the state. You will not break Hezbollah's popular base until the Lebanese state do not provide social services. It's as simple as this. Why would Hezbollah's popular base leave Hezbollah if the Lebanese state is not providing any form of services? Similar in Syria, the only way that they want to adopt or to implement the legitimacy is by force. We've seen the massacres committed in Sweden and the coastal areas with no guarantees given also to the northeast, majority inhabited by Kurds. So this is also an issue, how things have seen, because it's not the first time in the history of Lebanon, for example, that there's a project to strengthen the army in order to counter other political forces. In the 70s, 80s was against the Palestinians. Today is against Hezbollah. But this is short-sighted. What we need is legitimacy from below in both countries, meaning the state plays a key role. And here we come back to the key issue of the session, in reconstruction. In 2006, it wasn't the state that took the lead in Lebanon for reconstruction. It was Hezbollah through foreign direct investment. In Syria, also the state is not taking the lead. So here is the key issue, I think.
I think, sorry, I was going to say, what you describe really shows the fault line between the United States and the Europeans on that, because I do think that the Europeans do see, you're completely right, that a pure security-focused policy will fail. And that's why, as you mentioned, France does talk to the Hezbollah every once in a while. The United States with Israel as a much more force-driven policy in the whole region, which at the end will be unsustainable.
Totally.
This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Yet another vindication of this partnership with the global centers. What an amazing eye-opening conversation. We have about 20 minutes left, and what I want to do is pivot to some of the questions that are piling up in the Q&A section. And I thought, just picking up immediately on what Joseph was saying, and this emerging consensus of the combination of hard power and legitimacy through social services and reconstruction being key. There's a question from Paige Arthur about other powers, and the two that have come up peripherally in the conversation so far are the Gulf and the Gulf states and China. And it would be very interesting to hear from Joseph Jalal, maybe from Jean-Marie, also on the European perspective on these players. I mean, the Gulf states have come up as sources of money that will ultimately pay for, I don't know, Turkish firms to build things. And China has featured in the conversation as the external pressure which drives other actors. How do you see, Jalal, maybe let's go back to Libya, like how do these bigger forces act in the country? Bigger external forces.
The ability, I mean, obviously the most consequential Gulf state in post 2011 Libya, from the very first moments of the NATO intervention up until today, has been the UAE. There were moments where Qatar mattered, and sometimes in punctual moments, the Saudis matter. But the constant here, the elephant in the room has been Abu Dhabi. And of course, when Abu Dhabi started interfering in Libya, one major differentiator was its checkbook. Like we see right now in Sudan, the reason the UAE matters so much on Sudan is because it spends money. It's not so much because it possesses a large military or is very skillful at coordination. It's just if you spend enough, you'll end up succeeding, like what is happening in Al Fasher. And a lot of that, by the way, is being funneled. Those military means are funneled through Libya. That's the reason I mentioned it. So the same thing kind of historically happened for many years. The UAE, in order to accomplish whatever it wanted to accomplish, had to pull its checkbook and kind of bribe people. But over time, especially with the end of the latest bout of the civil war in 2020, illicit activities have mushroomed in Libya, which means that a lot of the natural wealth that really belongs to the population, a larger and larger portion of it has been diverted by the Libyan elites. And so in that dynamic, if you look at countries like Turkey and the UAE, instead of giving money, which Turkey has never done, but that's a separate issue. But let's say the UAE used to give a lot, started giving less and less, and what it started giving instead was help in helping Libyan elites in diverting wealth from their own population. That has been the differentiator. So, of course, there's always sometimes moments of acute crisis where you have to spend money to unjam a situation, and they still do that. But I would say that they have transformed from a player that is known for spending a lot of money, like it is now in Sudan, to a player that you have to kind of rely upon when it comes to money laundering, in terms of accessing to clean dollars, banking platform. If you want to have your wife live in a quiet villa with a Lamborghini, it's better to do it in Dubai.
So Dubai has taken over instead of Abu Dhabi. I mean, it's the commercial functions rather than the
of course, politically, it's Abu Dhabi that calls the shots. But yeah, you're right. The specialties of Dubai that have ended up mattering much more. Yeah, absolutely.
Joseph, how about? And I'm curious about China. Like China, not in the imagination.
Can I say something about China? The main problem with China is that for whatever reason, the international press refuses to cover the fact that China matters more and more in Eastern Libya. So it's more in the eye of the beholder. The reality is there. It's there commercially. It's there in terms of reconstruction. It's there militarily. It's there in terms of maritime access, in terms of really including, I'm speaking about Eastern Libya, for example, the maritime port that China is pursuing is Tobruk. Whereas just a few years ago, China was discussing One Belt, One Road with Tripoli. China has understood that it will make progress much faster with a more authoritarian, more Russian-inclined portion of Libya, where you don't have the risk of these gestures that are meant to please the Americans. Everybody is pursuing the Haftar family, so the Haftar family feels that it has room for everybody, for Russia, for China, for Belarus, for the US. The US is in love with the Haftar family these days, and nobody's really discussing the fact that China has been expanding its footprint. And again, it's not just commercial, it's also geopolitical and military.
Yeah, when you look at the trend, I think more and more you see legitimacy through hard power than through delivery of services, to be honest. I mean, thinking of China, I mean, I cannot not mention what the evolution of China in Myanmar. I mean, very far from the Middle East, but China has decided to throw its lot behind the generals in Myanmar, because at the end of the day, there they see a center of power that can control. And I think that's what you see with the UAE. More and more, it's about raw power rather than just delivering services, because money, even the richest countries, at some point runs out. And so you're going to see a harsher and harsher version of patronage, I think, in the region.
Joseph.
Yeah, when it comes to China, I think we have to also to remind ourselves that China is the main consumer of the Gulf oil.
Yeah.
There's been rising economic exchange between these actors. Also, China did play a political role when it came, although it was mostly symbolic, but still sponsorship of the Iranian Saudi kind of let's say, normalization path. This said, China's political role remains very much restricted and limited in the Middle East. And generally speaking, if we look at the Palestine issue, if we look at Syria, Lebanon, it's limited because it doesn't have also a lot to offer. When it comes to invest in a particular country, China, it is seeking particular natural resources. Libya has these kind of national resources, but when it comes to Syria and Lebanon, it's quite limited. Even prior to the fall of the Assad regime, there were quite good relationship between the Chinese authorities and the Syrian Assad regime, but the promises of 2 billion of investment never happened. It was part of the One Belt Road, but it didn't push for it. As well, we can see a balancing act. China was maintaining quite good relationship as well with the Israeli authorities, also trying to maintain investments, economic exchange. It's actually the biggest actor after the European Union, but as a country, the biggest economic trade partner with Israel. So it's quite also interesting to see that it's trying to balance and to find, but politically, it remains a limited military force. And this is where we can see also Russian is much less economically developed, but is a much more important military force that had influence, for example, in Syria or Libya, or even trying to foster kind of economic agreements or political military agreements with the Gulf. So this is for China, so it remains limited. If we look more at the Syrian case, they're also a bit still worried about the situation of the Uyghur forms of jihadists within Syria, what's going to happen with this. But what is more interesting, I think, in the Gulf monarchies, we have to notice in the past few years, there's been a major break that since the post, if you want, Arab uprising, where there was strong rivalries, after the COVID, the end of the kind of blocus or siege, on, as it was called, on Qatar, especially a major change from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is seeking a form of authority and stability in the region and understood that it cannot launch war like in Yemen, have hostile policies towards Turkey, Iran, if it wants to see its objectives of Horizon 2030 to be realized. It understood it needs authority and stability. This is why also they've been dealing in a very pragmatic way with this new Syrian regime. And the first stop of Ahmed al-Shari was in Saudi Arabia, because this is the key to the Arab League of States, basically, the League of Arab States. And Ahmed al-Shari was very clear. The revolution is finished. We're now building a state. We're not threatening you, and we'll give you, guarantees. And the UAE followed after this. And because the Saudi gave the green light, and I think we have to see that also you see the relations are much better between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Saudi Arabia and the UAE actually played quite an important role in the re-election of Erdogan by stabilizing the Turkish pound, promising investments, etc. So there's all these actors, despite their rivalries. This doesn't mean that they don't have differences, but they see that they have more interest into an authoritarian stability in the region, therefore finding solutions, and therefore a bit more forms of collaboration. It's also the same actor that pressured, when you look at the so-called ceasefire in Gaza, Turkey and Qatar did pressure the leadership of Hamas to accept. Yes. There's other reasons as well, but you understand all this, the way they see things, in a way to seek a form of authoritarian stability, I think, in the region, when you look at Gulf monarchies, despite their rivalries.
This is so fascinating. In the question bar, we have a new dimension which I think it's very interesting to bring to the fore. So we've had this back and forth about hard power versus welfare as key elements of hegemony. But Ibrahim, in his question, raises a third element, which conventionally fits as part of that kind of model of hegemony, which is justice. So legitimacy of a stronger political kind. And quite reasonably, in light of events in Gaza and the violence and the horrors perpetrated there, how do you see, Joseph Jalal, perhaps starting with you, the question of justice. Does there need to be a post-conflict reconciliation process? Is there any prospect of that? What could that look like? Where would it stand in our thinking? We've so far gone back and forth on hard power versus welfare. Like, is justice a separate pole? And how powerful is it?
Yeah, I'll try to give it a try. Justice has been really absent from the Libyan equation for the last several years. There has been no attempt at transitional justice or tribunal for a city like Tarhuna, known for its mass graves in 2020. There has been some efforts to instrumentalize the ICC. I would like to remind everyone that the ICC happens to be taking present-day Libya quite seriously. There is a very large number of international arrest warrants that have been sealed but are ready to be opened based on circumstances, and the number is absolutely outstanding. We're talking about probably several hundreds. So this means a lot of mid-level, sometimes even low-level militiamen in the east, in the west, in the south, and we're talking about also about militia people who have money abroad, so they could end up getting caught, and the whole politics of that is interesting because we're not witnessing a situation where logically, and that's actually what happened initially, was a rejection of that effort from the ICC, and then because of pragmatism, we saw the current prime minister in Tripoli embrace that. And he seems to have every intention of actually utilizing it, of course, in a very cynical way, but it's still a form of justice for the Libyans who have gotten used to nothing at all. It's the same thing with Derna. I'm sorry to keep hammering on Derna, but just the mere fact that Derna was in large part rebuilt, not very well, but it has been rebuilt. You can go and visit, and a lot of people who were out, without a home, maybe a year ago now, were given a home. The comment you hear is, we know there's corruption. We know that the reconstruction of our city has been used most likely for money laundering purposes, but at least they're doing something. So for them, relative to nothing, it's a form of justice. So it's not an absolute notion, but a very relative one in a country that has been used to a lot of impunity. But other than that, I think there's a lot of demagoguery that works without an inkling of justice. There's sometimes you see like initiatives by an attorney general who's trying to do the right thing, and then he has to kind of put everything on hold for several years because the circumstances have shifted. So that's the atmosphere in Libya. And I don't think there is a faction that is interested in really making a larger use of the concept of justice or the illusion of justice for their own selfish reasons. It's not necessary. I'd like to also just finish on the word reconciliation. The word reconciliation is very dangerous in a country that hasn't experienced any violent death at a large scale for more than 5 years. I'm saying this because the US administration seems to have every intention of using this word reconciliation. What it means is that the people who are currently at the top, who have not been elected, are going to pretend for the nth time to reconcile and pat themselves in the back and do other deals that, of course, consist in diverting even more wealth from the population. So reconciliation is the last thing that Libya wants, because what people imply by that is really reconciliation between the incumbents.
Yeah, fantastically interesting. Joseph, it would be great to get your view on this.
I think when it comes to justice, I'm not sure it could achieve hegemony, but it could definitely appease tensions, try to reach civil peace in a particular country. When we look at Syria, actually the current government has no interest into forms of transitional justice that has been very much put forward, especially by civil society actors, and because this new ruling actor, has committed crimes itself. So it has integrated in the new so-called Syrian army well-known people for the crimes they committed against different sectors of the population. whether they were part of the former Syrian National Army that was acting as a Turkish proxy for years. It notably played a destructive and criminal role when it came to the occupation of Afrin, a Kurdish area in Syria that was ethnically cleansed in many ways. But other actors, I mean, Ahmed al-Sharer, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, are guilty. And the problem, the absence of transitional justice, you have people taking justice in their own hands. So, for example, we very often focus, and rightly so, on assassinations that are occurring, for example, in the coastal areas against Alawite civilians, saying because this particular person was working with the security services and, no one targeted him or he wasn't brought to court. But we don't talk about Aleppo, where you have...
Don't worry. Yeah.
We don't talk about Aleppo, where you had assassination based on revenge, dozens of them. Moreover, so there's an absence of transitional justice, but there's also an absence of transitional justice when it comes to economic crimes. For example, there have been forms of reconciliation, how we call them in Arabic, with key business figures that were very well known for their affiliation with the Assad regime. A big name is Mohammed Hamsho, who was the right hand of Maher Assad for years. And now he appears, he made even a donation to the Syrian Development Fund. He appeared publicly, he's protected by the new government. Other war criminals have been able to find a form of reconciliation with the new government. Fadi Sakr, well known for his massacres in the Tadamun neighborhood. So what I would say is definitely the absence of transitional justice is a factor of tension, of not only promoting sectarian dynamics, but of violence within society. And therefore, obviously, it is needed. And also on the economic side of it, because many of these businessmen that benefited from accumulating lands in unjust way, or businesses, etc., this is the wealth of the people and should go back to the people, or at least the state, to be redistributed, decided collectively. But as a lot of things in Syria today, things are not decided, if you want, in a mostly participatory way, but from the new ruling elite in a way to consolidate its own power. Similarly, the new crimes committed, particularly in the coastal areas in March or against Sweda in July, have not seen any form of serious investigation. And when investigation occurred in the coastal areas, contrary to investigation made by Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, they said there was no direct involvement from the highest echelon of the state. Secondly, in the coastal areas, they denied there were kidnapping of women, which is a well-known fact. So you see here how it creates new form of victimhood from everywhere, which is not a path towards reconciliation, a real reconciliation, I would say, from below, by the people, and basically, build the path. Maybe I could appear sometimes very harsh with the new government. The problem is not, obviously, it's a very limited amount of time we're talking about since December. The problem is that the fundamentals to build a new society that is more inclusive is not being done. This is the main problem. It's not the amount of time, it's the fundamentals that are not present.
Joseph, thank you so much for that. What I'm going to take as the concluding comment on this truly fantastic panel, which leaves us on a note of the work that is unfinished and that is still to be done, with much kind of hanging in the balance, and provides us with a great jumping off point for the series of workshops that we will be hosting and have the pleasure of hosting with Amman and Istanbul. Thank you to everyone that's been involved in putting this together. I really have to say this has been a most rich and fascinating conversation, and I look forward to seeing folks again on our next call. Until then, may you all be well, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.